Well, thank you. Good morning and welcome. I'm really happy to see you all here to join in this session where we're discussing how much testing and for what purpose. During this session, please feel free to live tweet and follow using either the session hashtag #HowMuchTesting, or using the AERA 16 hashtag for the conference itself. And there are a couple other hashtags going around as well. Feel free to use any and all of them. So I'd like to start by sort of giving a description of our format, the purpose of the session, introducing our panelists, and then we'll go from there. The goal behind this session was to invite some prominent scholars to respond to the questions, comments, concerns, thoughts of public stakeholders, to really embody public scholarship by engaging with the public on the issue of testing and its purpose. And so a couple of months ago, we sort of announced the discussion was opening using the hashtag #HowMuchTesting, and tracked what the public had to say about that. And we've sort of collected some discussion prompts and some questions from that we're going to submit to our panel to discuss the purpose and extent of testing in our schools. We're going to begin with, of course, some introductions, but in the format of the main debate, each panelist is going to have an opportunity to make some opening statements. They'll have from 3 to 5 minutes to sort of set the context for the discussion. Then we'll move into a point, counterpoint, point format, where I'll present one of the discussion prompts or questions from the public. Someone will be invited to have 90 seconds to 2 minutes to make a point in response to that. Then another panelist will be able to offer a counterpoint, 90 seconds to 2 minutes. This counterpoint need not directly refute or address what was said before, but is sort of expected to look at it in a slightly different way. And finally, there'll be an opportunity either for the first speaker to respond if the second speaker did directly address what they said with a final point, or for an additional speaker to add a final closing thought, and that'll be for about 45 seconds to a minute. So let me begin by introducing our esteemed expert panel. Linda Darling Hammond, unfortunately, is not able to be with us today. She had some meetings on the Hill that she was not able to miss. And so I will be reading some comments that she sent in absentia as her opening remarks. But participating in the panel today, we have Eric Handshake. Eric Handshake is the Paul and Jean Hanna Senior Fellow at the Hoover Institute of Stanford University. He's been a leader in the development of economic analysis of educational issues. His most recent book, The Knowledge Capital of Nations, describes the economic impact of higher achievement. Prior books include Endangering Prosperity, Schoolhouses, Courthouses, and State Houses, and Making Schools Work. Government service includes being Deputy Director of the Congressional Budget Office. He is a distinguished graduate of the United States Air Force Academy and completed his PhD in economics at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Thank you, Rick, for being here with us. Our next panelist, Laurie Shepard, is University Distinguished Professor and Dean of the School of Education at the University of Colorado at Boulder. Her technical measurement work has contributed to validity theory, standard test setting, and methods for detecting test bias. More relevant to today's session, her studies of test misuse have addressed kindergarten readiness screening, grade retention, teacher testing, and the effects of high-stakes accountability testing. Shepard has served as president of the American Educational Research Association, the National Council of Measurement and Education, and the National Academy of Education. Thank you, Laurie, for joining us today. David C. Berliner is Regents Professor of Education Emeritus at Arizona State University. He has also taught at the Universities of Arizona and Massachusetts, and at Teachers College and Stanford University, and at universities in Canada and Australia and the Netherlands, Denmark, Spain, and Switzerland. He is a member of the National Academy of Education, the International Academy of Education, and a past president of both the American Educational Resource Association and the Division of Educational Psychology of the American Psychological Association. He is winner of numerous awards for his work on behalf of the education profession. Thank you, Dr. Blinner, for being here with us today. Thank you. And finally, our discussant turned panelist, Wayne J. Kamara. Wayne J. Kamara is Senior VP of Research at ACT and has served in a similar role in the College Board for nearly 2 decades. He is former president of NCME, the Association of Test Publishers, and vice president of AERA's Division D and APA's Division on Measurement, Statistics and Evaluation. He has served on technical advisory boards for PARC, 4 states, the Department of Defense, and the Department of Education, and various testing and credentialing programs. His research focuses on assessment validity, fairness, and admissions practices, and standard setting. Thank you, Wayne, for being present here today. Now, each panelist has an opportunity to offer some opening remarks. In his original role as discussant, Wayne J. Kamara has prepared some comments on the on the history of testing, to sort of set the context for today's conversation. And so he will make those points today, but I also want to just demonstrate how timing will be kept. The panelists will be able to see these circles sort of progress across the screen. When 3 circles are displaying, half their time is gone. When the yellow circle displays, they'll have 3/4 of their time. And ultimately, when the red blinking dot shows up, they'll have to stop. And that's the sort of unpleasant position I have to be in to make them do so. So let's hope it doesn't come to all that. There you go. Oh, let me make sure it's turned on. It's advance and go back. Great. Brilliant. Thank you. And I'll just borrow your chair while you're speaking.
Thank you, Matt. I'm honored to be here, even on the last day of AERA, to try to give some brief remarks about the history and the context of assessment. So let me begin with the testing standards. I think most people in the room may be familiar with the AERA, APA, NCME standards for educational and psychological testing, but I believe that's a foundation that we need to refer to when we talk about testing, and it really emphasizes the claims related to scores and how they should be interpreted, as well as the theory of action. And much of what we'll discuss today, I think, falls back on are tests used for the purposes that they were intended, and are the scores and the score interpretations supported by the evidence. In the last 2 decades, the focus has been on using assessments to improve learning, to hold students and schools accountable, but since the mid-19th century, standardized tests in education have been used for classroom and student feedback, system monitoring, selection, placement, and certification. The historical trends suggested by the mid-19th century, tests not designed to make formal comparisons between students were used for that purpose anyway. Henry Bernard, a prominent leader in the Common School movement, noted that it was inefficient and unfair in his view to have heterogeneous classes, and he sought to classify students. In those days, standardized tests did not mean norm-referenced, as we sometimes interpret it today. Instead, a standardized test was a test that had directions for administration, that the exam was published, that the directions were given, and that there was some consistency in terms of scoring or grading of the assessments. Tests often focused on a very narrow set of ideas, and there was a huge mismatch with curriculum. And while that's still a problem today, maybe it's somewhat lesser of an issue. The original World War I Army alpha and beta tests really took testing to a new level where they were emphasizing sorting and efficiency. And then there was a bit of a dark period in assessment. Galton, for example, a French psychologist, conducted research on heritability of traits. Phenology, a very crude method of comparing physical attributes, was persuasive to numerous scientists, including Mann. And Carl Brigham, who helped establish the initial SAT, was for a short period of time guided by eugenics, selective breeding, but later repudiated that. Historical trends also continued in terms of Harvard University had 10 exams for admissions in higher education. Tests such as geometry, physical geometry, English grammar, English composition, ancient history, Greek and Latin. Universities would often alter the number and quality of their admissions requirements at will, and high schools really were not prepared did not know how to prepare students for college, as colleges changed the admissions requirements and often the tests that they use every so often. In 1892, the National Council of Education and a group of 60 prominent educators appointed a committee of 10 who developed a charge to try to help with the transition from high school to college, and they called for uniform high school programs and requirements for admissions. They also talked about rigorous courses, but with some student choice, and also the importance of high school influencing college admissions. The creation of the College Board happened around the turn of the century, and the first SATs included chemistry, English, French, German, Greek. Each subject was tested by a chief reader, and there would be 2 associate examiners. Answer books were scored on a 100-point scale, with 60 being the passing score, and if a grade was below 60 by the reader, it went to a second reader. The fee was $5, and as you all know, the SAT evolved with 4 or 5 major revisions, the most recent being this particular year. The mid to late 20th century saw the rapid expansion of testing. Machine scoring of answer sheets began to revolutionize how quickly things could be done. The GI Bill gave access to many veterans leaving World War II. Educational testing service was established through 3 not-for-profit organizations, and the ACT was initially created in terms of trying to stress more of an achievement versus an admissions test. And that leads us to today, where we've been ushered into the era of educational reform since at least the nation are at risk. Emphasis has shifted from inputs such as minimum competency to outputs such as college readiness and international comparisons. We saw the creation of the National Assessment of Educational Progress, a survey of student performance across the country. And then we've seen more recently in the last couple of decades an increased desire for accountability and testing to have teeth, whether it's to evaluate teachers and educators, common core standards, balanced assessments, and today we see a majority of states still participating in one of the 2 consortiums, about 21 of the states administering either the SAT or the ACT to all high school juniors, and that produced some of the events that we're going to discuss today. There's certainly some backlash to the expansion of testing today. Today there's increased concern about the opt-out movement. It's become an issue of the political campaign. There are numerous tests required, especially for high school students, whether it's for admissions, placement, accountability, teacher evaluation, and never mind state accountability for non-federal regulated subjects and local needs in terms of interim and formative tests, which have really driven up the amount of time used for tests, not counting the amount of time that individual students devote to preparing their students for those tests, and students devote to preparing for tests outside of class. Technology has produced increased burden on state and accountability tests. As we see today, many teachers complaining and instructors complaining that testing goes on for a 4 to 8 period of window just because the computer lab is so limited in terms of accessibility. So there's an increasing divide about local control versus state and federal control, and all of these issues, I think, result in some of the discussion we'll have today on accountability and the opt-out movement. Back to Matt.
Thank you, Wayne. I think that gives us a really good sense of where the conversation is now. Now, at this point, I'd like to go ahead and read the comments that Linda Darling Hammond sent in absentia. She writes that for more than a decade, Congress has been unable to reauthorize the increasingly unpopular No Child Left Behind Act passed in 2002. In an act of unity after the trauma of 9/11, the bill set noble goals for educational improvement and equity. However, its methods led to criticism of federal overreach. as it sought to guide school reform by setting annual targets and sanctions for schools attached to student standardized test scores. In pursuit of the unattainable aim of 100% proficiency for all students by 2014, nearly every public school in the United States has been deemed in need of improvement or failing and is meant to be in some form of intervention. Other US DOE initiatives have further expanded testing by requiring states who sought relief from the law to implement teacher evaluation based on student test scores, raising the total number of tests for students into the hundreds in some districts, and triggering an opt-out movement by parents. Despite the intense focus on testing tied to consequences, achievement gains have slowed in the NCLB era, and achievement gaps have remained stubbornly large. By far the largest gains for African American and Latino students on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, and the greatest reduction of gaps in reading and math occurred before NCLB in the 1970s and early 80s, when ESEA and the nation focused on investing rather than testing. Gains were also larger in the 1990s than they have been since. For example, the NAEP Long-Term Data Trend Report finds the following. Black 9-year-old students gained 19 points in reading between 1971 and 1980, and 15 points between 1994 and 2004, but only 9 points between 2004 and 2012. Hispanic 9-year-olds gained 9 points in reading between 1994 and 2004, and only 9 points between 2004 and 2012. Virtually all progress for 13-year-olds and every bit of progress for 17-year-olds happened between 1971 and 1988, and the children from the Great Society years made their way through school. The greatest gains and the greatest gap closing for Black and Hispanic students in math also occurred before the NCLB era, generally in the 1970s and 80s, as those who were young children in the 1970s made their way through school. Furthermore, between 2000 and 2012, U.S. scores on international PISA tests, which measure higher-order thinking skills and applications of knowledge, declined in math, reading, and science. The NCLB strategy, which led to a focus on low-level tests of basic skills, has clearly not worked to raise achievement or close the gaps. Nonetheless, despite repeated attempts, Congress has been unable to reach agreement to redesign the law. This week, the Senate may take an important step towards changing that, as Senate Help Committee Chairman Lamar Alexander, Republican from Tennessee, and his colleague Patty Murray, Democrat from Washington, bring a bipartisan bill to mark up that has a real chance of success. In recent weeks, one of the hottest debates has been about how often federally mandated testing should occur. Some argue, with good reason, that annual assessments are needed to ensure that students are making progress and that steps are taken when they are not. Others argue that every child, every year testing requirement has reduced test quality and focused the curriculum too narrowly on low-level skills that can be measured with multiple choice items. They prefer to return to state testing once in each grade span, as was true in the 1990s. But so far, the debate is missing the most important question: what kind of assessments should be used, when, how, and for what purposes, if we want high-quality learning to occur? Thank you, Linda Darling Hammond, for submitting those comments. Eric Hanishek, if you would like to make your opening comments.
I actually thought that I was playing the role of Linda Darling Hammond this morning, but I guess I'll have to give my own remarks since she sent some in. We're coming off the No Child Left Behind era, and that has had ramifications for how people think about testing and what testing has done. If you look at NCLB era, it was a badly designed law. It had all kinds of flaws that were readily apparent after the law was put into place. They were never changed, but even with this badly designed law, there have been gains across the board in achievement under No Child Left Behind. It would be easy to change the accountability system and the testing that goes with it. What I would do, first off, is to measure learning gains instead of the level of achievement, instead of setting some arbitrary level of what is proficient. But I would continue to have subgroup identification so that we can, in fact, address equity issues. Each of these, I think, would improve things, but it is hard to say that No Child Left Behind did not have an impact. Secondly, it is impossible, in my opinion, to think of ever improving a system where you don't have good measurements of the performance of what's going on in the system. So that this discussion of, well, maybe we should just get rid of testing or only have Finlandish tests at the end of high school and so forth, I think is misguided. That you have to keep track of where you are, and to an economist, providing incentives on what you've been able to accomplish makes a lot of sense. Not the crude incentives that were done by NCLB. NCLB was actually backwards, in my opinion. The federal government and the nation as a whole should be declaring what we need to know in terms of achievement, and then local districts, states and local districts should be deciding how to do that. That's exactly the opposite of what NCLB was, because NCLB told states to declare what people should know, and then if students weren't gaining or up to the levels that were required by the standards of each state, the federal government said how to fix education. So it was entirely backwards, but it still had an impact. So in my opinion, we have to continue regular assessments. The opting out movement I see as a bad thing for the U.S. I think that the U.S. will be damaged if, in fact, we have New York State-style opting out, because what that does is eliminate the use of any of the data and make it impossible to keep track or find out who is doing well and how we should proceed. So the opting out movement, I think, is really a movement to end all testing. That is against the interests of the United States. If we could, for example, on the international tests that have been mentioned before by Wayne, if we could get up to the level of Germany, which having a co-author in Germany, it doesn't seem impossible, that could amount to about 3 times our GDP over the next years because of the added growth. The future of the United States is entirely dependent upon the skills of its population. And if we let those skills languish relative to other countries, the United States is in long-term trouble.
Thank you. Laurie.
I want to first apologize because there's an echo up here, and I can't hear anything unless I read their lips. So I'm concentrating.
So just agree, Laurie, just agree.
Luckily, I've been able to position myself to actually see what Rick was saying. This country spends far too much time and money. The size of the investment is enormous. Too much money on standardized tests. We do need good data. We would have better data if, for school accountability, state and national trends, we used matrix sampling over a much broader array of content domains than reading and mathematics. Right now, we're locked into this idea that we can't trust the data unless every student takes a mini ACT test every year to get ready, starting in grade school, for the ACT they will take later. That is probably the nugget of what's the most wrong about how our systems are being constructed. It would be far better if we use some of the strategies from other countries to check that kids are on track to be proficient, to go to college, etc., by examining calibrated student work and helping teachers internalize those standards and help the kids even learn what does quality work look like. And that's how we should track every year and answer parents, not with the mini ACT for fourth graders. In my opening time, I also wanted to make a point that's not quite in the province of what we were assigned about the greater harm that's occurring all year long due to test prep. I think that is understood, but also to the effects of the interim tests that were ushered in by No Child Left Behind. And those so-called benchmark and interim tests are cheap versions of the standardized tests. Their content is worse on average. Won't swear for every single item, but we've examined them, and they are cheaper and not as good even as the state tests, for which you've seen lots of evaluations prior to PARCC and Smarter Balanced. Those interim assessments and that industry have produced products that say they are formative, that say they get kids to be on track to the end of the year, but the studies that have been done by myself and others at CREST, and by CPRE authors and by others, asking teachers how they use them. They don't get information beyond which kids need help, and then they assign them something not informed by the test content, just which kids are worst and which standards are worse, and then they reteach. By however way, they invent, sometimes thoughtfully with teams of teachers, but not informed by the substance of the test. Taken together, those interim assessments and the end-of-year tests give kids a distorted picture of what real learning looks like and does some very horrible things in terms of intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. The kids get feedback about how many more points they need, not what substance they need to learn.
Thank you, Laurie. I appreciate that. David Berliner.
Hi. I have some of the same points that Laurie just made, and I'd love to debate Eric separately on some things about the $1 trillion or so we'd get if our scores went up, and I just wonder why Finland's economy has gone down for 7 straight years, even though they beat everybody else. So we need to talk about that. Anyway, the opening remarks were supposed to be about testing and for what purposes and whether there's too much. And I kind of turned it around and said, what can we do in which we don't need a test? It's costing us a lot of money, a lot of time. Maybe there are other things, other information we can garner without the testing. We live in an age of metrification. Economists, business leaders have liked the numbers. Our newspapers are filled with numbers. Sports teams have numbers. USA Today publishes factoids with numbers. And numbers have taken on something of a talismanic characteristic. And I thought, what can we do to rethink some of that? And I thought, well, we've learned a little bit, like ACT and SAT are to predict college performance, but then we learned that for many kids, high school grades does a pretty good job, and a lot cheaper, a lot quicker, and how much worse? Not clear that it is much worse. Maybe better. For identifying kids who need help, something that states say they want to do, In my state, my chief state school officer said, we need to give the test all the time. We have to find out what kids need help. And I said, I can do it for you in 10 minutes and no money. And he said, no, you can't. And we went out with my colleagues. We got 55 teachers in Mesa to 2 weeks before the state test to predict the scores on the state test. The correlation was 0.8. They almost never missed the bottom 5 and the top 5. So here's your gifted, here's your kids who need help. I did it in 10 minutes for no money. And the chief state school officer said, we have to have a test. That's the only way. So this metrification, this objective, in quotes, information, maybe overwhelms us a little bit. The benchmark tests, again, teaching people formative assessment. Dylan Williams has books out on it. He does a very good job of translating the research into what teachers ought to do. Formative assessment's important. The benchmark tests aren't doing it. So I think one of the things we ought to keep in mind is what are alternatives to tests that give us information that save us time and money. Money is very tight in schools. The amount of money being spent on testing and the platforms for testing could well be spent on other things like early childhood education, teacher salaries, and that sort of thing. So my plea would be, can we get information that's useful without a formal, expensive, time-consuming test?
Thank you. I appreciate that. So now, as we move into the discussion prompts that came from the public conversation surrounding the hashtag #HowMuchTesting, I'd like to start with I'd like to start with a Facebook user who writes under the name Virginia SGP, and whom I shall refer to as Virginia and use the feminine pronoun, though I'm not really certain of Virginia's identity. She writes that she's a parent of 2 primary school children, and she thinks that testing is about right, particularly the annual testing in math and English language arts. She goes on to relay a personal story in which the state of Virginia's student growth percentile data revealed to her that the students at the school that her children attend do not show as much growth as similar students in other schools. She also speaks in favor of the detailed, though not necessarily timely, information that she gets from the state test about areas in which her children need extra help. What comments do you have for Virginia regarding student growth percentile models and the data that they provide parents, schools, and districts? Who would care to respond?
Here's what I would say about student growth percentiles. This parent is using it better than a parent who thinks that their own child's student growth percentile can be interpreted reliably, in that it's being used as the aggregate. But I do think that with respect to all value-added models, parents need, if those data are shared with them, some simple ways to understand. And I've practiced some and gotten feedback, and maybe this will help. I do think it's important to know that student growth percentiles are in the class of value-added models, but that's what we would refer to as an undercorrected model. So there's still lots of things about resources that surround the teacher, including how all the other kids in the class contribute to that result, that mean that we can't just use that to evaluate that teacher, different from overcorrected models that go in the opposite direction, and there's not the sort of Goldilocks best way. So I think that parent probably is holding on to that score as meaning something more accurate than it is, and ask the parent to track how that changes from year to year, because the instability of that information can sometimes be a learning experience. Like, yes, you can trust it grossly, but you can't trust it for the kind of thing that your pediatrician, for example, can tell you about other more precise tests.
Thank you. Response?
I would just say that I'm impressed that Virginia knew what student growth percentiles were at some level. So I think that is a level of understanding that most parents and many educators do not have. I agree with what Laurie said, but I also am concerned as a psychologist that even at the aggregate level, we often ignore what we know about human psychology and development. Student growth percentiles in the earlier grades really trouble me because students develop cognitively and physically at different progressions. And we make these generalized statements about growth and proficiency, and it does lend themselves to comparisons with other schools, where I think the right comparison is with criterion referenced outcomes. I think it lends us to have a false sense of the accuracy of the data. So while I think it's much better than most status models that I've seen, I think some of the uses really have to be weighed, and the use of student growth percentiles to make high-stakes decisions about educators, for example, is something that I think is quite troubling, and that many of the models do not account adequately for all of the other factors that influence the quality of education. And the focus, as Laurie said, our over-focus on English and math to the detriment of other subjects and holistic learning not only, I think, weakens the quality of education, but eventually will continue to have us focus on curriculum the way it's established today in English and math courses, and strikes against any kind of reform efforts that try to combine across discipline.
Absolutely. Eric.
So that we're now getting into the normal discussion of testing where we have a list of the horrors of value-added assessments and how they can be unstable and uncertain. We actually know a lot about value-added assessments, particularly at the school level, but also at the teacher level. And while you can find bad cases, and some states are using bad methods, you can also see that it provides very useful information to go along with other assessments of both educators and of schools. And it would be a mistake to argue that because there's uncertainty in the testing of the value-added measures, we shouldn't use them. There is almost certainly as much, if not more, uncertainty in the assessment of educators by observational means.
Thank you. So,
Can I add to the question or not?
Add?
I would just add a comment to the
Yes.
question. I would just point out that one of the mistakes that could easily be made with the student percentile growth is attributing it, this parent might attribute it to the school leadership, to the teachers. That's the first order of kind of looking for cause, believing the data. But we really know that cohorts are very powerful factors in the lives of schools. And the reanalysis of the Coleman data actually says that he probably underestimated cohort effect and overestimated family and income effects. And everything I know about schools suggests that's true. Cohorts are really important, and the attribution is often made to principals and teachers when why your score is a little lower may be because of who's going there.
Thank you. Well, and so this brings me to a discussion point that sort of came up in some of the conversations that we have had and didn't really come directly from the hashtag conversation. There clearly is a great deal of testing, and it was established for a purpose. And is that purpose being met? And are we meeting the goals for which testing was implemented?
We have the echo, and I didn't even hear.
Oh, so are we meeting the goals for which testing was established in the first place? Okay.
So as I said in my introductory remarks, I don't think we are meeting the goals for which testing was established. If you view testing as part of the state accountability systems that began in the 1990s and then continued through to No Child Left Behind in 2002. And that's because we had an extraordinarily poorly designed national accountability system, as far as I can tell. But because NCLB was poorly defined doesn't mean that testing is not giving us a lot of useful information. It is, frankly, in response to the earlier questions, an extraordinarily cheap method of finding out what's going on across schools. Testing, we spend $12,000 per student per year on average in the US on schools. Testing costs a few $100s. Evaluations by observational means cost more than that if done seriously. So it's not the expense, it's how we use it and get the value out of it.
Any response? Laurie.
First of all, I don't think people were clear what the purpose was. They were going to find bad schools and fix them. I don't think we get accurate information about which schools, and for sure we don't gain information about how to make them better. So I agree, I'm a longtime supporter of national assessment of educational progress. I serve on the NAEP Validity Studies panel. I want to protect NAEP from the politics of what has been layered in with NCLB. So the way that Rick and I disagree has to do with what we both want is to protect the good data and to be able to track the good data and not to cheapen the measures so that, or to have such teaching to the test that his studies and ours find this big discrepancy between national assessment, both with respect to standards, cut scores that have been set on those assessments, and also what the trends look like on those separate measures. So I'm for taking the politics out of testing, not trying to use the test as a lever for change, forcing teach this way so that your scores will go up. Keep good data at the national assessment level or at the state level, and then assure parents by some calibration of student work, because we do sometimes have teachers that give A's and it's not on track work. I understand that kind of problem that your parent from Virginia was having, but that by pouring those all into one set of purposes, you make kind of a mess.
Thank you.
I think sometimes the claims and the purposes are not defined, so it's difficult to say that they are or are not being used for that purpose. If you were a CEO and you had 5 manufacturing plants and 2 of them were not performing up to speed, and you had to get involved in improving the productivity of those plants, would you primarily wait for one time a year and base your organizational change on the performance evaluation that supervisors gave workers? That's not the way you get efficiency and improvement in organizations. And so part of my concern with accountability is that we believe that, we don't state it, but we see tests as improving curriculum and reform somehow. They haven't done a good job of that. They do make changes, but we change our standards, we change our cut scores, we change the assessments we're doing so frequently that we're not getting a stable measure. And I don't see tests as the most efficient or successful means of improving curriculum. They do many things quite well, not as well as multiple measures will be, and if we look at college admissions, we know that. But tests have a role, but sometimes they're misused or used in ways that they're not developed.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to a question that was posed by Monty, a reader of one of the blogs that helped us promote this session. He posted a reply to the question that questioned the well-thought-out purpose of testing in our schools. His post suggested that modern tests do not inform day-to-day instruction. but that they have created demand for what he calls the e-industrial complex to sell technology, both hardware and software, for what connectivity and infrastructure, testing platforms, and for new vocations related to educational testing, such as school-based technology administrators, testing coordinators at the school and district level, and lots of positions writing and analyzing tests and their output. How do you respond to his points? Laura?
Well, let me just amplify a little bit about what I obviously I agree with Monty, that since NCLB, Patricia Birch is actually the best person who's gathered actually some of the financials on the testing companies that have just flourished as a result of the demand. Actually, a lot of it came from school boards that wanted to be on track to beat NCLB requirements, and so started giving every 6 weeks or every quarter these interim or benchmark assessments that were called formative initially. We had a fight in the literature, and that's how the name interim assessment was arrived at, to say that they're just intermediary to the final end of year. They don't really serve formative instructional purposes. They set off alarms. Oh dear, do something about these kids or about these standards that aren't being met. But it's a distortion because they had to create so many items. Most of them are only multiple choice, so it was a backward step in the quality of the content of those tests. And then the kids just get that over and over again. And I said this before, but it's really important. When we look at what the kids are told after sitting at those computers doing that, they learn how many more points they have to get right. Not what they have to do to improve their writing or understanding of certain kinds of mathematics problems. They just need to try harder, and they sometimes are not told how to get better. And that's part of the harm of this. They're also being posted in hallways, and you're developing a culture of scores and rankings. So I agree with what Wayne said earlier about the fact that standardized doesn't mean norming. But that's what's happening. And the technology from old norm reference tests is what is affecting classrooms and students.
Thank you. David?
Yeah, I responded to Monty this way, that money corrupts. Testing and off-test use, as well as purposeful testing, makes a lot of money, lots of it. So of course we have to be very careful that we really need a test for a particular use. Just as we have to be sure we really need a prescription, since prescriptions, like tests, are often used off-label, not necessary, don't have the effects they're supposed to. And I don't think there's any difference between our decisions about a prescription we have and a test for a school. We have to be sure it works, and if it works, we should spend the money. But the question is whether there are alternatives, which I started my overview with. Does it have to be on a computer? Well, I'm not against computers. They're wonderful. Maybe the kids need them. But if all they're doing is figuring out how to psych out the next point, then it may not be working, and we're spending money unnecessarily. I think we need to keep in mind how purposeful this test is for the goals of our schools. And if we can answer that in the affirmative, we should spend the money. But if it's not clear, we ought to be very careful with that money because we need it for a lot of other things.
Thank you, David. Rick?
So I think this discussion has been very useful in talking a little bit more deeply about the purposes of testing. My interest has been in the summative tests at the end, to use that as an overall portion of a management tool, not the entire tool. And that should not be confused with the use of formative assessments that guide the day-by-day operations of the classroom. And some of this has become bastardized, as Laurie suggests, because the summative tests have bled over into quasi-pseudo formative tests. But those are things that can be solved, frankly. It's not an inherent element of the whole thing. We have some pretty bad state tests that people are spending too much time on this bad state test. That does not mean that first we can't do a lot better on our testing, and secondly, that we can't use the test for the purposes of helping to guide the management of schools.
Thank you. I'd like to go ahead and go to a question that was posed by someone I know personally. I'm in a unique position in this conversation. As I finished my dissertation, I've stepped back into the K-12 classroom, and the media specialist at my school had this to say about this conversation.
Due to increased testing, the school library was closed for 9 weeks last year. That's 1/4 of the school year. Students were unable to check out books because the media center was needed as a space for computer-based testing. I understand that testing can give us some valuable data, but when the number of tests increase to the point where we're closing the doors that lead to the love of literacy, is it worth it?
Wayne?
My perspective on testing is shaped primarily by my training. I've worked for most of my life in testing organizations, but I'm married. My wife is a school social worker and went back to become a first grade teacher. So she works in a POC state, and it could be said about many tests. But the move to technology is probably number 2 beyond national standards for why there's such a backlash. Schools have usurped technology laboratories, libraries, and have disrupted the curriculum. In her school, which is a K through 3, think about that for a second. K through 3, only 1 of the 4 grades are being tested, 1/4 of the students. They took her special ed aide out of her classroom for 8 weeks to sit outside of the testing center because the 3rd graders who might need to go to the bathroom needed someone to escort them to and from the bathroom, which is remarkable considering 1st grade students in her classroom go to the bathroom on their own, but the 3rd grade student needs to be escorted because they're in the middle of a POC test. For 8 weeks, the schedule was totally disrupted. It was much worse than not using the library. So I think the push toward technology, for technology's sake, is really a problem. ACT, College Board, every publisher out there is being pushed to say the tests delivered on an iPad are comparable to a test delivered on a 26-inch computer screen to one on paper. Now, if you take a test, a practice test on an iPad, tell me if you can answer those questions as quickly as you could on a 26-inch screen. But technology is one of the things, the push for technology is really usurping the quality of assessment, and it's leading instruction where instruction should be leading assessment.
David?
Yeah, I just have a quick comment to the question, Laurie. It was that I thought it was a silly question. Tell the parents that you can't use the library. Get the parents involved. It's like the opt-out movement. When people get mad, they do something. This is a bureaucratic, stupid situation, and it needs to be fixed. It's a management issue, and the principal and the parents are the ones that can solve it.
I just want to echo what David said. Bad management is bad management. Stupid decisions are stupid decisions. But that's something different than how we organize the system, the incentives we put in, and what we hope to get out of the system.
So we all agree it's stupid, but whose fault it is, I think, is up for grabs right now. Because the move toward technology, I agree completely with Wayne, is perverting the representation of content as well as creating all of these bureaucratic problems. In many cases, the principal is in love with the interim tests. So, you know, it's not like every educator feels oppressed by these things because we've bought into a system of management and control that those instruments are part of. So I would have trouble saying at whose fault it is, except that this regime was mandated, and then all of these different responses have occurred. They're all side effects of an ill-conceived thou must system. And the question is what to take back so that people can reorganize toward quality learning and make sensible decisions. Preserving the data. I'm in favor of preserving the data, but you've got to roll something back so that people can reorganize.
Thank you, Laurie. I'd like to move to a question posed by Candice, who describes herself as the parent of a gifted third grader in Ohio. She describes that her son passed the reading test with no problem at all, but that fell 3 points short of writing an appropriately complex passage in response to the writing prompt, which put him on a daily writing intervention plan per state law. She says that he has, quote, come to disdain writing even more and is working to write the most simplified sentences possible rather than growing as a writer. She suggested that there should be a box that students could check in order to indicate, quote, that they just don't care about this essay and this test. Her comment raises an interesting point for this panel. It actually raises a couple, but the one I'd like to address at this point is, how does student motivation affect the results of the assessment, and how does that affect the decisions that can be made on the basis of it? Laurie?
This question is framed as if we have to worry about the integrity of the test result, and I would say that that's second. Even this parent is still buying into the system by saying, I need a checkbox. What I would say is that we need to think about how this entire layer of experience is affecting kids' understanding about learning. We have evidence that working to get better at performing on a test, this commodification of why you would try hard or why you would learn, taking completely the student out of the context of just loving writing is what is happening with so much of the interim testing and the preparation for the end-of-year test. And importantly, this happens disproportionately to students who are second language learners who are struggling some way in being told that they aren't proficient over and over again. So it's that motivational context as well as the detriment to the score performance on the test that we have to think about.
Rick?
So I agree that student motivation is a huge issue. I don't think we essentially have strong enough incentives for our students to work hard at the same time that we have other issues in the schools. And I think that increasing those incentives would be useful. If you look internationally, the countries that have the strongest incentives for the students, where the testing really has a material impact on their lives, you see that they do better on these testing situations and that it helps. And so I would personally want to increase the incentives for students to be motivated, and it's not that if we could leave the interim assessments aside, which I think is an issue that's not central to this whole thing, but to think of better incentives for the students along the way.
Dave?
Jim Popham talks a lot about teachers needing assessment literacy. And if such a course ever went in or such a program ever went in, one of the things they'd learn is that cut scores, which is what this person is complaining about, one of the things they'd learn is that cut scores are completely arbitrary. So this kid missed the cut score. Who knows what the cut score was, you know? And if you miss it by a little and the teacher knows this is a kid who's really okay, kid comes from a family that's promoting literacy, the prescription for that kid was wrong. Okay? And assessment literacy enters into that. The other part of it was motivation. Well, of course, my own history is so clear on that. I went to college because I was supposed to go to college. I didn't know what I was doing. I took business courses. I failed business math my first semester. I took it again, and I got a D. And then I found a subject matter I liked. I found college to be fascinating, so I moved into calculus, and I got an A. There's no difference, you know, it has to, motivation. You want to learn or you don't want to learn. So clearly, it's an important issue. And on the issue of incentives, Eric's maybe talking about Korea or some other places. I don't want American kids to have that as an incentive. I like that their incentives are different. I like American childhood. American childhood leads to lower test scores internationally. I'm absolutely sure of that. It also leads to America being #1 on the Getty Index, which is an index of entrepreneurship. It leads us to be #4 on the OECD Innovation Index. American childhoods are not incentivized to take tests. They're incentivized to be American kids who are really among the wonderful kids of the world. They're doing all sorts of wonderful things. You remember when the Apple Store opened for apps? Something like 100,000 16-year-olds flooded Apple with apps. That's what America produces a lot better. I'd rather have no incentives for taking the test and incentives for being a youthful exploration of the world.
Thank you.
I wanted to use this as a little opportunity to talk a little bit about the question about motivation, to talk a little bit about the summative assessment, to focus on summative assessment, because I do believe that we do have very good summative assessments that can always be improved. Summative assessments are abysmal at providing instructionally relevant information, maybe at a classroom level, but then you're going to have a test that's 8 or 10 hours long. So the recommendation or the reliance on summative for that kind of information is probably not a good use unless you really do like multiple days of testing. But let's look at how we do summative. And again, I want to use the example of admissions. We know in college admissions that the best predictor of success is the grades that students have accumulated over 4 years. SAT, ACT, add to that, and 70% of students have very consistent behavior. And a third factor that's very predictive is the rigor of the courses students have taken. Now, admissions offices, maybe not in a mechanistic way, do look at all those factors. But somehow when we're talking about college readiness, we're going to rely on a single test score. And when I was with the College Board, I did a study that was not well cited, but it basically showed that college readiness can be predicted for students in high school by combining test scores with high school GPA and with an algorithm we developed that rated a student's academic rigor, the courses that they've taken. Have they taken 4 years of math with calculus the highest, or 3 years of science with physics and chemistry? And all 3 of those provide a much more reliable and much better prediction about college readiness. Nobody cared about that because that was more complex, and we like to use, whether it's POC or Smarter Balanced or ACT, a score. And I think as a profession, we have got to reinforce the importance of multiple measures. It's done in employment, it's done in admissions, but somehow we don't want to do that in summative testing and education.
Thank you. we're actually,
I have to have one quick response on innovation, since that's one of the things that I am concerned with as an economist. I don't think it relates so directly to kids being kids as it does to the incentives of the aggregate U.S. economy. It's not the schools, it's that we have the best economic institutions of any nation in the world. We have free and open labor and capital markets, we have secure property rights, we have strong incentives for people to produce apps as opposed to just playing earlier. To give you one simple summary statement of the issues in my mind, if you look at the PhDs in STEM fields in the US today, 55% are foreign-born. We, as a nation, have to increase the skills of our own people, along with bringing in the smartest and the best from abroad. I'm very much in favor of that. But we also have to improve the skills of our people so that we can have homegrown talent that is producing the future innovations.
thank you. And at this point, we're going to move into our closing remarks. And Wayne, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. What I would say is that Randy Bennett did a paper recently about the opt-out movement, and one of his findings were that states like New York, for example, which have the most or had the most severe penalties for educator evaluation using standardized tests, had the highest opt-out rates. And states like California, where you would expect a much more politically active population in some segments, had a pretty consistently low opt-out rate because tests are not being used in a large part for penalizing or evaluating teachers. Now, I think the information on tests is relevant to evaluating schools, states, districts, teachers, but I think we need to do that very carefully, and it cannot be a preponderance of the evidence being used. I also think that what's happened in the last decade with the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act was a shame. I sat on a state TAC that got one of the initial grants, and we were asked to figure out how to evaluate oboe players in a very small state with one teacher. So they wanted to bring in oboe players from an adjoining state, teachers, to evaluate this teacher. In PE, they needed pre and post measures. So we were asked to try to conceive of how many sit-ups and push-ups a student could do in third grade in September and what growth would be in June. And that was done by misguided administrative policies. So I think, I am very supportive of tests, and I think tests are a very efficient means and are very valuable. And I'm equally ashamed when I see colleges say that we're going to use test optional policies because they provide good information. And any rational person knows that if you've got a strong student with a bad test score, but everything else is wonderful, you can discount or ignore the test score, just as the colleges I applied to conceivably ignored my low grades in Spanish, hopefully. So it's good judgment, it's using multiple measures, and I think sometimes when we misuse tests, whether it's from the publishers or whether it's from the policymakers, we create many more problems than if we just use them in the proper venue.
Thank you. Laurie?
I'll take this moment to just say a little bit more about incentives, because I agree that incentives work, but incentives mean something very different to economists than to motivational psychologists. And those two literatures really teach us some very different things. So extrinsic rewards work, but we have evidence in the motivational literature for decades that extrinsic reinforcement can drive out. There are studies of kindergartners not doing as much play of a certain type if they got reinforced for it with pizza chits. So it is important to think about when you're going to use those kinds of incentives There are always incentives in a system. You can't just not have them. So you need to figure out what they are, and you need to think about when and at what age you want to impose them. Because just as there are incentives for who excels, kids who see themselves falling short are, in quotes, demotivated. That is, they abandon trying hard. So you need to understand all the layers of the evidence about the effectiveness of incentives and decide whether you want to do that to third graders or eighth graders. And then in what kind of array of ways could you do it for high school students so that we're not just sorting the kids into one array and deciding here are all the wonderfully successful kids and here are all the others. That's what our system has tended to do, and that's what we need to avoid. For good data, I'll just reiterate what I said previously about the need to think about the national and state level, district level, summative tests using matrix sampling across broader arrays of subject matter.
Thank you. David?
Thank you. The time went very quick. I wanted to just read to you the schedule for 2015-2016 in the state of Florida, the assessments for kindergartners. Okay? From August 10th to September 30th, they will take the Florida Kindergarten Readiness Screening. It's a work sampling system, and they will also get the Florida Assessments for Instruction and Reading. From March 2nd to April 3rd, they'll take the Comprehensive English Language Learning Assessment. From April 13th to 17th, they'll take the Stanford Achievement Test, 10th edition for reading and mathematics. From April 13th to May 29th, they'll take the Florida Assessment for Instruction and Reading Assessment. From May 11th to June 5th, they'll take the district-designated end-of-course assessment. And in case they haven't had enough tests by that point, Florida teachers have the option of giving them the Iowa tests, basic skills and tests for educational development, either in English or in Spanish, to see if they are gifted. And two, they can decide to give them a placement test for speakers of other languages, because they have to have the Miami-Dade County Oral Language Proficiency Scale revised to make a decision about that. That's for kindergartners in the state of Florida, on the record, on the books. And I guess what I thought of when I saw this is Valerie Strauss published this in the Washington Post. I mean, aside from thinking people are nuts because they don't know kindergartners, it's an issue of whether our profession has a voice. We have early childhood educators, and if the profession's voice, all the wisdom of our early childhood educators is going to be ignored because the bureaucracy has taken over, we have a real problem. And it seems to me that the profession, early childhood educators, developmental psychologists, have to find a way to push back on a bureaucracy that's trying to get metrics on everything. And I don't doubt they want to help these kids, but they're using the wrong mechanisms. And a profession, we claim to have a profession, it needs to stand up and do something about that.
Thank you. Rick?
So the issue is, how do we improve our schools, in my opinion? We're 30th in the world in math at age 15. That doesn't sound like a very good mark when we're competing with Portugal and Greece, not the countries we would want to compete with in general. So the issue is, how do we improve this? There is a suggestion that it's either interim assessments or testing of kindergartners that is in fact holding us back, but that's not the case, because we had that situation before NCLB, and it's a question of how do we improve our schools. I think that proper use of testing, not bad management and dumb ideas, is in fact extraordinarily important for us to know where we stand and to be able to tell how we're doing next to other countries. The idea that more play and less testing is going to make us Finland, this strikes me as lacking much empirical basis, and lacking any historical basis. And so I hold out that I don't want to test every moment of every day. I don't want to use bad interim assessments. I don't want to use arbitrary cutoff scores that have no meaning. But I do want to have measurement of performance of schools and educators that is used in a sensible way with other indicators. It's should never obviously be the sole indicator, but it provides information that we cannot get in other ways. There is no way walking into a classroom in Palo Alto schools that you can tell how well that is doing on an international standard.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we find ourselves with just a bit of time left. Would you care to engage some audience, some questions from the floor?
I would, but can I say something?
Yeah, absolutely. Laurie.
We were asked to talk about testing, and so we have, but I feel the need to respond to Rick about like how would you improve our schools? And I would have tests in place so as to evaluate whether we were making progress. But I would not use the tests to drive the change, and I would invest in curriculum, which we have not been since No Child Left Behind, and I would invest in professional development. And look at, for example, the videos that came with TIMS in Japan at hour-and-a-half long problem solving that was going on that is not representative of what happens in U.S. classrooms. So there's, I believe that there is something sort of outside the bounds of how our conversation was structured that I would invest in, and a lot of attention needs to be given to that.
Thank you. So at this time, do we have any questions from the floor?
Just comment on the new test and the PARC test and the SBAC test. Are they then an improvement over what we've been doing in other states?
The question was to comment on the new tests, the PARC test and the SBAC test, and are they an improvement on what we've had in the past?
I would say that they are an improvement because they tried to have more ambitious content. They tried to have some practices in the domains represented as well as just content. But they were driven by this idea that every kid had to be tested on everything. And that's why PARC takes 11 hours. And I'm saying, why can't we have that content, even better content across a broad array, and use matrix sampling to get good data instead of having that be so onerous and still not really serve its purpose well and drive other things like more NCLB type testing.
Wayne?
I was one of the technical advisors to PARC. I agree with Laurie. I think the tests are an improvement over what I've seen in state testing previously. And I strongly agree with her comment and call for matrix sampling. I think the fundamental premise that we need to measure every student at every grade level and only in English and math is flawed. It's just badly flawed. We do not, I think what Rick has said, and I'm very supportive of Rick's comments and call for measurement, we do not need to test every student in every grade. A second concern I have with state tests is increasingly the belief that we need to measure every standard. And that will get you an 8 or 11-hour test. Now, testing has fundamentally always been designed and been acknowledged to be a sample of behavior, whether we're talking about an assessment center or a structured interview or an SAT. Nowhere, or an employment test, has there been the premise that we need to measure every single skill and piece of knowledge to hire an employee to be a programmer. But somehow we're in this rut now where we've got to measure every single standard. And so what publishers are doing, they're documenting that they've got one item to measure this standard. Now, you know one item doesn't mean very much, but it's almost like a checkbox. And if you do not have one item for every standard, you're missing the content alignment. That results in an 8-hour test. And so for those reasons and what Laurie said, I think they are better, but I think we're missing the bigger point, is they're not anywhere near where they should be.
David.
And I think they're wise counsel here. But again, one other point is already made. It narrows our conception of what it means to be a smart kid in school, because we're only testing a limited piece. So all the kids with other skills for drama, for art, for dance, the humanities, for acting, those for cooking, for voc tech, for fixing automobiles. If this is how we're judging a smart kid, we have made all those other kids dumb, and in a way. And it narrows our conception of what it means to be a fully functioning human being who seeks excellence, whether it's as a chef or an auto mechanic or in the humanities. And we just have to worry about it. So the tests are better, but the bigger question is it narrowing who we judge to be smart and then therefore hurting other kids who aren't up to those standards in those two areas?
Brilliant, thank you. Yes, sir. Thank you.
That's your favorite.
So is it safe to assume that
I guess
everyone
the
heard question?
economist has to speak to that. The problem with the U.S. in terms of the income distribution is the bottom 35% of the people that have limited skills in a modern economy, in the innovative economy that is based on knowledge. And if we don't, in fact, improve the skills of those people, we're in trouble. Now, over time, there has been glacially slow improvement in achievement gaps. They have improved a little bit, but it's been much too slow, and I think that's a societal problem. I think this is all only vaguely related to testing, because it's whether we can use a system that includes tests and other mechanisms to improve our schools, and particularly improve our schools for people at the bottom end of the skill distribution, because they are not going to have the same kind of jobs that low-skilled people of my parents' generation before had.
Laurie.
So I guess I would speak more like a sociologist, and I would answer that the testing regime is exacerbating inequality, because what it's doing is having kids who don't measure as proficient get worse and worse treatment and be labeled as not proficient. That's how they understand their place in school, and that's how teachers perceive them, and they get drill, not deep learning. So I appreciate that Rick is saying we need to respond to that group of kids particularly, because they need certain kinds of skills to thrive. But if what's happening and you go investigate the consequences in schools for those kids, it's worse and worse opportunities, not better opportunity.
Wayne.
I'll harken back to admissions testing, and when admissions tests were first introduced, they were aimed to minimize those issues. Now, sometimes there are negative consequences to admissions testing, I'll admit that, but I will say that important high-stakes decisions will be made. UCLA will never admit every applicant, and Google will never hire every programmer who applies. And we know that when subjective measures are used, it results in bias. It results in hiring individuals and selecting individuals that look like us and have similar expectations. So standardized tests, reliable and valid, have an important role and can address that. Where we have problems, I believe, is that we measure too narrow a range of behaviors. If you know about college success, you know that 60% of students who do not complete college drop out and have good academic standing. So as important as verbal and math skills are to college success, that is not going to guarantee persistence or graduation. So there are non-cognitive factors, metacognitive factors that are equally important. So by basing decisions on a holistic set of behaviors that are associated with success, we will not only introduce fairness. I've done some research on alternative non-cognitive predictors. They will result in much more diversity if they were used by colleges, and they're factors that are in the mission statement of colleges. So I think there's a lot more, but I'm primarily a proponent of standardized and valid instruments to make these important decisions, and I do think that they will lead to better decisions and ultimately more diversity, but I will admit that is not going to be the primary purpose of any test.
Yeah, I just want to say it's not just developing the skills in people. I mean, inequality is killing us in so many ways, but the answer is not greater skills. The Bureau of Labor Statistics tells me, if I read their reports, we have 11 million STEM graduates not in the STEM field. We have, every year we're producing 144,000 more STEM graduates than the job market will accept. So we're actually overproducing skilled people for the economy. It's the economy and the jobs offers for people that's leaving a lot of people behind. The creation of the jobs is the problem, it seems to me, not the skill sets. We're doing that. We're meeting that requirement, but they're not working.
Thank you. Well, ladies and gentlemen, we've come to the end of our allotted time, and I'm certain that this discussion could go on much, much longer. And in fact, I'd like to invite you to continue this conversation online using the hashtag #HowMuchTesting. Please join me, if you will, in thanking our distinguished panel for their contribution to today. Thank you. I really appreciate the discussion that we've had here, and I believe that some very important issues have been raised, and I hope that we can work together to find resolution to them. Thank you.